Resolution Foundation. I'm Torsten Bell, the Chief Executive here. Now, hello, we're in action. Right, now, you're in a think tank, if you didn't know. Think tanks love talking about rules. Okay, we are totally hot on rules. Some think tanks like talking about new rules. So we're like, I've got a big proposal for a big new rule, a new regulation. In our case, usually for the labour market, in other people's cases for whatever. Some other think tanks love talking about scrapping the rules. It's not ever clear what the exact ones they want scrapped are, but they definitely want fewer rules. That's why we get bonfires of the quangos and regulations on average every 3 years. And on average every 3 years, 0 actually gets scrapped. But hope is important in life and in think tanks. We are not today, so today is different. No one is allowed to talk about new rules, TC, the scrapping rules, business. We're only going to talk about enforcing them because a genius once worked out that actually it probably matters as much what you actually do with the rules and whether anybody actually applies them as it does what they actually are. This is an insight. I know anyone with kids, the difficulty is not coming up with the rules for your kids. The difficulty is the little buggers never let you enforce the rules, and then you're into a crisis about did you enforce them too harshly? Should you have gone harder? They're out of control. Whose fault was it? I think that every morning when my little bugger gets up. So that is what we're about today, the enforcement. So to help us discuss that, we're first of all going to hear a speech from Matthew Taylor, who is the Interim Director of the Labour Market Enforcement Body, but is also lots of other things. I'm not going to go through everything, but he's Chief Executive of the RSA. Once upon a time, most of what Tony Blair did was his fault, except for the wars. So we're going to hear from him. Then we're going to hear from Lindsay Judge, who is a Principal Research and Policy Analyst here at the Resolution Foundation and leads a 3-year project we are doing on labour market enforcement in brackets. It will involve calling for some new rules. So we will break our own rule at some point over the next 3 years. Then we're going to hear from Kate Baird, Head of Economics at the Trade Union Congress, who will propose some new rules as well as talking about enforcement. And then we're going to hear from Neil Carberry, Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Both of these guys are also on the Low Pay Commission, so we'll get some minimum wage enforcement through the course of the morning. And then we're going to hear from you guys. So, Matthew, welcome. Over to you for your speech.
Thank you. I'm afraid I actually am going to propose a couple of new rules at the end. So I'm breaking the rules that you've set me. I don't know what it is. There's something about this room. I've been in this room before, and I've worked out what it is. I think it kind of feels like we're sitting in a very wide-bodied jet, and you're all kind of. That's where
where are we going?
And I'm kind of the air.
Where's the jet going?
I kind of feel like I ought to be telling you where the exits are. But anyway, thank you, Torsten, and to your colleagues at Resolution Foundation for hosting the event. I was pleased to hear that the Foundation is undertaking a major project on labour market enforcement and compliance. I'm a great admirer of the Foundation's work, and so I hope today's one of many future collaborations with my office. So this is my first speech in the role of Interim Director of Labour Market Enforcement, and thank you very much for coming along to hear me and joining the conversation. I took the role on 6 months ago, and as anyone who knows me will attest, such reticence is uncharacteristic, not to speak publicly for 6 months, but I have been very much in learning mode. In a couple of weeks, we'll see the publication of the first annual report that I've overseen. So ahead of that publication, what I want to do today is to talk about what I've learned so far, to identify some emerging priorities for my office, and to, despite what Torsten said, actually make a couple of specific policy recommendations. So in taking on the role, there were kind of two perspectives that framed my approach. The first is to look at the issue of compliance through the lens of public value theory. And what that really means is thinking of state interventions in terms of their direct effects, their indirect effects, and their broader systemic impacts. So from that perspective, failures to comply with labour regulations or to act on non-compliance have direct effects for those who are denied their rights and entitlements, and in more extreme cases are subject to forced labour. But systematic non-compliance also has a knock-on effect in that non-compliance in one area of regulation makes other breaches more likely, And also specifically because bad employers who break the rules can make compliant firms uncompetitive. That latter phenomenon is particularly noticeable in relation to the savings on tax and workers' entitlements made by companies bending or willfully flouting the rules on employment status, which is an issue I'll come back to later. So that's the direct and the kind of indirect effect. But there's also the systemic effect, which is that the experience or even the perception of widespread non-compliance can more broadly undermine the faith of citizens, businesses, and civic institutions in the efficacy and reliability of public policy and implementation. And given the kind of tenuous state of legitimacy their institutions have, it's important that they are seen to be able to implement the rules that they generate. My second starting point is a kind of unerring focus on impact. In the face of the frequency of public policy failure, maybe it's just the frequency of my own public policy failure in think tanks and in government, the RSA, my day job, has developed an approach to change which we refer to as thinking like a system and acting like an entrepreneur. And so applying that idea, it's important to think about the systemic context for compliance, because that comprises not just the rules and their enforcement, but also social awareness, norms, practices, as well as an appreciation of the range of incentives which operate on labour market actors. So we need to think about the ecology of compliance and try to influence that ecology, not just focus specifically on the rules. And overall, and this I guess is my kind of lifetime, increasingly unpopular, friendless political position, I favour a pragmatic approach to change, focusing not just on the improvements that might ultimately be desirable, but what we can actually achieve at any particular moment, or to put it more simply, the art, the possible. So that's how I approach the job, a kind of public value lens and a focus on what is it we can achieve given the overall ecology of compliance. Now, I'm performing this role, interim director, for 1.5 days a week. I'm new to the detailed issues of compliance, and there are an awful lot of detailed issues of compliance. So I've had to rely on the patience and experience of the excellent small team in my office and the insight of a variety of helpful stakeholders who've brought me up to speed and allowed me to ask them very stupid questions. So what have I learned so far? First, I have developed an enormous respect for the managers and staff of the 3 bodies whose work I oversee. That's HMRC, National Minimum Wage, the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, and Employment Agency Standards based in Bays. There is no conceivable future in which the resources dedicated to compliance and enforcement will match the scale of the problem we're trying to tackle. Even when the bodies make progress, as they often do, a combination of business innovation, the creative skills of accountants and lawyers, and criminal intent mean that the bodies are aiming at a moving target. To complicate things, labour market rules exist alongside a range of other regulatory frameworks in areas like health and safety, environmental protection, immigration enforcement, taxation. Nevertheless, from the leaders of these bodies to the frontline staff I have met, I've found people who are committed to making a difference and actually open to new ideas to make their work more impactful. My annual report, published in a couple of weeks, will show good progress in relation to many recommendations made in the office's 2018-19 strategy, although I am bound to say, in passing, that we're still waiting for the government's response to our 1920 strategy, which was submitted almost a year ago. In terms of progress, let me give you a couple of examples. The serious non-compliance team in HMRC is doing really effective work in tackling businesses that deliberately flout the rules with significant consequences for workers. EAS are working hard, despite their really modest capacity, to significantly raise their profile amongst agency workers. The GLAA have established and deployed the labour abuse prevention officers of their PACE powers, and labour market enforcement undertakings and orders are now being increasingly used by all the bodies as enforcement tools. Overall, and this is really critical to the work of the office, there is better joint working between the bodies and in relation to other agencies and stakeholders, a development which augurs well for the prospects of a single enforcement body. The second thing I've learned is that the work of compliance and enforcement is inherently complex. There are many different business models and forms of employment to understand and seek to regulate. Employment regulations are complicated, they're not always easy to interpret. It was welcome this week to see the government announce measures which should reduce unintentional non-payment of the minimum wage. The range of non-compliance stretches from common forms of what are sometimes referred to as technical breaches, particularly in relation to the national minimum wage, to less common but more harmful examples of labour exploitation. So the bodies work as well as they can, but their priorities and methods are inevitably shaped by institutional habits, organisational capacity and their varying statutory powers. Third thing I've learnt, I guess, is that one of the things my office is charged with is assessing the scale and nature of non-compliance. But in doing this, we are to a significant extent, not just my office, but the whole country, flying blind. While there is a great deal of data and improving systems for gathering and sharing intelligence, we lack authoritative research on just how widespread non-compliance is. To do such research well is challenging and costly. The method has to overcome issues like finding hard-to-reach people, those who are unlikely to seek redress, either through fear of reprisal or limited knowledge of employment rights, which can be exacerbated by poor language skills. Indeed, addressing this research challenge, understanding the scale and nature of non-compliance, is one of my priorities, moving on to my priorities. Building on the work commissioned by my predecessor, Sir David Metcalfe, and with the expert advice of the ASRC, our ambition is to launch a major piece of research this year that will address the gaps in our knowledge and also provide a strong baseline from which to assess the impact of the proposed single enforcement body, bringing the three bodies together. Now, participating in the development of the single enforcement body, the SEB, is a second priority for my office. The government's commitment to create a single body provides a stronger focus for this work. I provided a substantive response to the Bayes consultation on the SEB, and I have suggested to DLME, my office's sponsor departments, that with some modest additional funding, we could play an important role as a bridge between the detailed Whitehall process of designing the SEB that is going on at the moment and the wider engagement of stakeholders with an interest in the SEB's success. This new body is a major opportunity for the UK to be and to be seen to be at the forefront of effective compliance and enforcement. And it's vital, in my view, to gain the insight and build the enthusiasm of businesses, trade unions, campaign groups, academics and research bodies and other regulatory agencies. Moving on to a few kind of ideas that I want to throw out into the room for conversation. One specific avenue I want to explore further in the coming months, which relates to that point I made earlier about the kind of ecology of compliance, is around the scope for more robust forms of voluntarism. As I've said, despite the good work they do in publicising employment rules, encouraging compliance, the existing bodies will never have the capacity to inspect anything more than a tiny fraction of employers, a point I think the Resolution Foundation made in a report last year. And in certain areas, compliance capacity seems particularly inadequate. So, it is in no way a criticism of the great team at EAS to say that, despite some increase in their staffing, it is difficult to see how they have the capacity to tackle non-compliance in umbrella companies, which is a new responsibility they're having, or the burgeoning online recruitment sector. But yet, one of the things I've come to see and heard a lot in the last 6 months is that workers, consumers, investors, organisations at the top of supply chains and public procurers are keen to have some assurance that the organisations, the labour providers they're dealing with, are trying to do the right thing. I've been pleased to see in Scotland, in Wales, city regions like Manchester, various forms of good work charters which encourage employers to sign up to principles, including, of course, compliance with the regulations. I support the government's announcements this week to make the minimum wage naming and shaming scheme more timely and focused. So actually, when you look out there, there is a multiplicity of schemes and forms of validation which claim to help labour providers and users make good choices. Most trade associations claim to have systems of vetting and sanctions which are applied to their members. But I think a lot more could be done. In particular, I want to explore the role that the bodies, particularly in the context of the SEB, might play in either establishing or auditing voluntary schemes. Now, no kind of assurance scheme guarantees compliance, but it can substantially reduce risks and give labour consumers useful guidance. I note, for example, that since 2012, public procurement of security services by the Scottish Government has been restricted to members of the Security Industry Authority's voluntary approved contractor scheme. Before taking on the role of interim director, my primary focus in the area of employment had been on regulatory reform and particularly the measures recommended in my Good Work report of 2017. And although the brief for my role this role I'm undertaking now doesn't explicitly include the development of regulatory policy recommendations, my predecessor did advocate investigating the potential of reforms like joint responsibility across supply chains or the impounding of hot goods, and we're still awaiting the government's response to those suggestions. Our capacity to tackle non-compliance is clearly shaped by the adequacy of the regulatory framework in light of evolving business models. So I do believe it's my role to recommend changes if they're necessary to improve compliance and enforcement. So today, in closing, I want to focus on two policy issues. First, I want strongly to encourage the government to address the issue of employment status in the forthcoming employment bill. The bogus attribution of self-employed status to workers is currently one of the most widespread and deliberate ways of denying people their rights. Furthermore, as long as workers are wrongly categorised, the bodies are unable to enforce their rights and individuals have to rely on the risky, slow and impractical route of employment tribunal. Now, I don't underestimate the challenge of getting status rules right. Indeed, from what I can see, it's an issue in just about every national labour market. Nevertheless, and notwithstanding the impact of the new IR35 arrangements, I continue to believe that it is a priority to strengthen, simplify and align the rules on employment status. Finally, I spoke earlier of the need for pragmatism in the face of the evidence and the opportunities for change, and in scanning the intelligence generated by the three bodies and by other enforcement agencies, including the police, my office draws up a list of priority sectors where the risks of non-compliance and labour exploitation are greatest. And each year, as part of our annual strategy, we choose some of those sectors for particular focus. This year, we'll be looking in more detail at construction, agriculture, social care and hand car washes. But even between these sectors, I think there's a distinction to be drawn. Because while there are major issues of non-compliance in construction and in care and in agriculture, most activity in these sectors is law-abiding. However, having spoken to staff in the bodies and amongst those who are experts, I've concluded that a range of forms of non-compliance are endemic in the hand car wash sector. The problems extend beyond employment regulation to issues of health and safety and environmental protection. Enforcement officers I've spoken to have told me they've literally never visited a hand car wash which did not exhibit non-compliant behaviour. And HMRC and MW believe that wage theft is endemic. The nature of the sector also means that the risks of serious labour exploitation are much higher, and without action, I believe it's only a matter of time before we see further incidents of harm occurring in the sector. Now, the problems with hand car washes have been raised before, not just by OGLME, my office, but by a wide range of other bodies, including the Environmental Audit Committee. We've seen useful initiatives, particularly the Clue app and the Responsible Car Wash scheme. And while these schemes have not made substantial inroads into the problem, they have played an invaluable role in highlighting the extent of non-compliance and in this case, the limited efficacy of voluntary approaches. So following a recent workshop on the sector hosted by my office, I've concluded now that the only answer is to establish a mandatory national licensing scheme for hand car washes. It's not for me to try to design such a scheme in detail, but my instinct is it should be nationally managed, probably by the GLEA, with their experience of licensing, but administered by local authorities with licensing fees set as far as possible to cover the costs involved. Local authorities already have experience administering such licensing, and there may be other upsides for councils given evidence from Nottingham Trent University that most car washes are not registered for business rates. I also think, by the way, that such a scheme should widen liability by making it an offence to unknowingly rent land to an unlicensed car wash business. I just want to emphasise in closing that I'm not someone who supports regulation for the sake of it, nor do I think there's some kind of philosophical reason why hand car washes should be licensed. I'm simply responding to the evidence that's been presented to me and to the urgent need to tackle the problems and dangers associated with this sector. Since 2016, when Prime Minister Theresa May, remember her, announced what became my Good Work review, we've seen a process of incremental reform designed to improve the rights and protections available to workers. Many of the measures I recommended will become law in April, including the Day 1 Statement of Terms and Conditions, the abolition of the Swedish derogation, and a massive reduction in the threshold for workers to request the right for representation, information and consultation. We await the government's response to a number of other proposals, including low-pay commissions ideas to tackle abusive zero-hour contracts, and, as I've said, the important issue of employment status. The establishment of the SEB is another opportunity to achieve a step change in compliance and enforcement. It's really important that the momentum is maintained. Far too many people in our country suffer exploitation or unpleasant, stressful and dead-end work. It's clear the public want more to be done. I said in the Good Work report that it's possible to combine the strengths of our labour market, particularly the diversity of work available and our high employment rate, with the ambition to improve the quality of work so that every job is fair, is decent and offers scope for fulfilment and progression. 4 years on, I am, if anything, more confident that the goals of full employment and good work are not only compatible, but integral to building a better economy for all.
Thank you very much, Matthew. There's a lot in there, running from knowledge about enforcement, where we look forward to the research you're commissioning, through the institutions to enforce it, where we have this big issue of a single enforcement body, but then particularly this issue of sectors where you definitely broke the rules on asking for more regulation. We know you're a regulator at heart. On hand car washes, but voluntarism within a broader range of sectors is obviously a different kettle of fish. And then a golden thread running through all of it, of good work on your regulatory proposals, but also on your enforcement one. So that is there's a lot for us to pick up there, which is what we're now going to do. So, Lindsay, over to you.
Thanks, Torsten. I guess it wouldn't be a Resolution Foundation event if I didn't start by telling you about a new piece of analysis that we have out today. So we've been taking a look at the BEIS Public Attitude Survey Tracker, and we've done some analysis of that, and we've got 3 findings from that, which I think fully support what Matthew's team are trying to do in terms of increasing the kind of oomph behind state enforcement of worker rights. So our findings are essentially that low paid, low skill, contingent workers are less likely to know about their employment rights. They are more likely to have a problem, even though they claim that they have less knowledge to begin with. And they're also less likely to take formal advice. So they're less likely to go to a union, to go to ACAS, to go to a solicitor, or even go to the Human Resources Department in their own firm. And I think this absolutely makes the point that there is so much value to what Matthew and his team are doing, and we're delighted to have them here. I want to pick up on 3 points that Matthew made and kind of lean into some of the work that we've been doing under our labour market enforcement programme. The first is the question of the evidence base. And I completely agree, Matthew, that we really struggle to fully understand the scale and the nature of labour market violations. And that's not surprising. I mean, the data is very poor. Firms are not going to knowingly report a non-compliant behaviour. Workers often don't know their rights or have better things to do or are scared of reporting them. So we struggle with this. But I think there's actually quite a lot that we can do if we're quite creative with the data. And to give an example, a couple of years ago, we did a piece of work that identified a pay penalty for agency workers. So in other words, if you had 2 people doing the same job, same personal characteristics, one an agency worker, one not, the agency worker experienced a pay penalty. And we put that forward to BEIS at that point in time, saying, this is not conclusive evidence, but this is the best evidence you're going to find, essentially, of the prevalence of Swedish derogation contracts. So there are things we can do in terms of sort of imputing meaning, if you like, from quite scanty data. I think the other thing I wanted to say on the evidence base is that actually we do know quite a lot about the scale and nature of labour market violations, but that comes from qualitative studies. And I think we have a real issue about how we leverage qualitative work for policy impact. So I can think about our own work where you can put forward a whole set of observations from a set of focus groups or interviews, and fundamentally they're quite easy to dismiss as a set of anecdotes. And I think it behoves us as researchers to think carefully about how we set up our research and how we communicate those findings, but it also behoves policymakers to take qualitative work a bit more seriously. So that's my first point. My second point is on the issue of intentionality when it comes to labour market violations. So Matthew mentioned that the government announced this week that it's going to resume the naming of firms that have found to have underpaid the minimum wage, but they're not going to name firms that have accidentally underpaid the minimum wage. And I think that we would 100% recognise that there are complexities within the law when it comes to the minimum wage, and that some of those are very difficult for firms to navigate. But I think we also need to recognise that increasingly there is not a bright line between accidental underpayment and deliberate underpayment. I mean, if a firm just didn't know about the regulations or didn't know about a particular complexity, how much responsibility did it have to actually know, to find out about that? And I think if we move to a situation where we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about intentionality, that has 2 potential impacts. The first is, presumably, there's quite a lot of people in HMRC who are going to be adjudicating on the firm's state of mind. And second, that fundamentally undermines the deterrence effect of the regime. And then my third point is, again, to sort of reiterate what Matthew said in terms of the need to be responsive to the political realities within which we live. And I absolutely agree that we've got the employment bill this year, and that's a great opportunity to pick up issues like worker status. But I just wanted to flag not just an opportunity, but a risk. And that risk is around the fact that we are heading towards a new migration regime. So we know by this time next year we'll be in a completely different set of rules around migration. We don't know the specifics yet, but we have an idea of the broad contours from the work of the MAC. So, for example, it's extremely plausible that low-skilled, low-paid EU workers will be subject to much tighter controls. And I think, again, that has two implications for enforcement. The first is, of course, that makes that population more vulnerable. So it's likely that we're more likely to see issues around that population. But the second issue, and especially thinking forward to the SEP, is that it raises the risk that the enforcement bodies will be expected, if you like, to be part of the migration enforcement regime. So big questions, I think, around data sharing for the new regime in terms of how it reports on migration status, and big questions about whether, if it's set up in a way that means it is in effect sort of part of migration regime, whether NGOs, grassroots organisations, trade unions, the bodies that Matthew pointed to as being so important for the development of the SEV, will actually want to be part of that project.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. That last point on we as a country spend nowhere near enough time discussing what the follow-throughs to our labour market are from this change to the migration regime. And like in other countries in the US, this overlap between the migration and labour market enforcement regime is kind of a core part of the public policy debate, and we basically have zero of it. And we've got about a year to sort that out before this just starts happening to us. Great, Kate.
Great, so thanks very much for the invite. It's particularly nice to be taking part in this conversation which crosses government, business and unions, because we think that kind of tripartite approach is key to solving this problem. And I guess it's a really nice panel to be celebrating the end of the Swedish derogation, which allowed agency workers to be paid less than those in regular pay, a long-standing trade union campaign. And I wanted to say thank you to Matthew for sharing a copy of his speech in advance, so I could at least think a little bit about what I might say in advance. So three things I wanted to do. Picking up on Lindsay's point about qualitative research, I was going to remind us about what this is about on a day-to-day level. I was going to actually respond to Matthew's speech and then defy Torsten by proposing some new laws. So thinking about kind of what is the human impact of this? Well, we were recently seeking evidence from our unions to respond to Matthew's latest consultation on the DLME strategy. And I just thought I'd give you a kind of couple of examples of what came up from that. So we heard about non-compliance in the agriculture sector, and one particularly resonant example from Unite was around someone who'd been working for a farmer for 20 years, she'd never been paid, and she'd only ever raised the issue because she was now worried about retiring and losing her tied accommodation. So she'd never had a decent wage at all. That was her experience. She'd assumed that that was completely normal. Bit of quantitative evidence. Unison surveyed their social care workforce and found that even after the changes to pay slips, 2/3 of them couldn't tell from looking at their pay slip whether they'd actually been paid for the hours they'd worked. Again, a huge issue of kind of how do you know whether your employer is complying with the law. And another example actually from Unite in the construction sector, we had a quote here, a construction worker who told his union rep about the experience of working for an umbrella company. And he said, I pay an umbrella £100 a week to get my own wages, I've got no holiday pay, no sick pay, and I can't work anywhere else if there's no work for a few weeks. And this was actually on a publicly funded contract he was working. So I think Matthew's really right to say that these are complex issues to tackle, and I think we really welcome the use of innovative new tools, and particularly the licensing scheme in the car sector. And I think you're also right, Matthew, to raise the issue of kind of, this is a huge issue and we've got a lack of resources. But we think there's a bit more we could be doing to use the resources we actually have. So we've got 130,000 union reps in workplaces, and at the moment we don't think they have sufficient ability to be raising third-party complaints and to be getting the information when they raise those complaints about what's actually happening. We also think there's a key opportunity in the governance of the new institution, of the new single enforcement body, to embody that tripartite approach in that institution and use that knowledge and resources of those kind of reps on the ground. As I mentioned earlier, we often see labour rights abuses on government-funded contracts. I think we've got a big opportunity. Government's about to embark, so we hear, on a huge infrastructure spend. That's going to require a whole load of new construction contracts. There's lots of examples we could be learning from, like the example of the London Olympics, or in fact in Heathrow, where we had a framework agreement with trade unions, which ensured kind of stamping out of the labour abuses which can be too prevalent on those contracts. And you raised the really good procurement examples around kind of the Scottish Government, many other examples in procurement to actually put in place those standards that we want to see. I think I was going to echo Lindsay's point about ensuring our enforcement efforts aren't hampered by bad policy and practice. We hear repeatedly from unions that attempts to combine enforcement with immigration is really, really problematic. It makes workers scared to report on issues for jeopardising their own status or perhaps the status of their colleagues. And we hear that when enforcement efforts are led by immigration, often issues around national minimum wage compliance, for example, simply get missed. I wanted to raise a note of caution around something Matthew said around employment status. We have been campaigning for a long time for a radical simplification of employment status and ensuring that the rights currently enjoyed by people classified as workers are aligned with those classified as employees. These are rights like the right to return to the same job after maternity leave, which currently you don't get if you're in various forms of insecure work. But I think if we go for a kind of simplistic approach, one thing that's been floated is simply aligning tax and employment law rules. We are going to see a significant number of losers. Either you'll have a group of workers who pay more tax without receiving any more rights, or you'll have a group of workers who simply lose the limited rights they've got. And I think we need to think really carefully about proceeding on that. So just to put forward our kind of new regulation please part. And I think Matthew talked about kind of voluntary schemes for auditing supply chains, but we do think we should go much further. So our proposal, which we've been pushing for a while and we think we managed to get the last director a little bit interested in, is actually for a legal system of joint and several liability in supply chains. We think if you are economically benefiting from somebody's work, you should be responsible for their employment rights. And I think, as if Matthew said, we want to actually change the ecology of enforcement. We need this real shift in who bears the risk and responsibility for enforcing people's rights.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. It's very upsetting to hear the TUC say that there's a big danger people might pay their tax. But apart from that, everyone should pay their tax. Right. Last but not least, Neil.
Everyone should pay their tax.
Also good.
Thank you, Torsten. Thanks for Resolution for hosting this. And as Kate said, thanks to Matthew for sharing a copy of the speech in advance. I suppose the first thing I do when asked to respond to a speech is look for the quote that I want to respond to. And the one thing that Matthew said that really resonated with me looking at our sector in staffing and recruitment is there is no conceivable future in which the resources dedicated to compliance and enforcement match the scale of the problem. Now, I say that, I should say I think EES do a fantastic job in our sector. They're asked to do a lot, but I think Matthew, I would read that quote as saying there's something more than simple enforcement here. There's how we separate out compliance and enforcement and ensure that the body as we move forward towards the SEB are properly focused on enforcement, and we find ways to boost compliance through government's stewardship of the labour market, which I think was absent for a long period in terms of thinking about things you might do in the labour market other than just passing a regulation. But also in terms of what we as business leaders and industry leaders can do to ensure our sectors are in good shape. That piece around this being inherently complex is absolutely true. I look at the various ways in which my members supply people into British companies. There are a number of things there that are difficult for people to understand, even from a specialist position. I run the REC, we have a legal helpline. We have a legal helpline because the number of employment lawyers in Britain who really understand the 2003 conduct regs is very, very low. So one of the most common calls to our helpline is, my employment lawyer says this, and our lawyers are saying, no, this. And that speaks to the complexity of it. I mean, you banned Kate from proposing new laws. Didn't ban me.
Everyone's at it, it turns out.
Yeah. The piece Matthew raised about umbrella companies is phenomenally important for the government to deal with. Because there are plenty of reasons why a small agency might want its payroll outsourced, but there's also plenty of opportunities there for bad things to happen. So, and one of the main points we made to the Chancellor in our concern about the IR35 changes is they're going ahead before the umbrella legislation, and the IR35 changes are basically a massive push to umbrella.
Why don't you?
So,
not everyone spends their life in the IR35.
IR35 is the way we tax contractors, and as we tax contractors, they are more likely to be deemed to be inside IR35, so they have to be taxed PAYE. They have to be taxed PAYE. They can either go onto an agency's payroll or be dealt with by an umbrella company. And then you have to choose an umbrella company. And the sharpest people, the sharpest minds in business, many of them work in those companies, and they are adept at finding different ways of doing that, some of which are entirely legitimate and some of which are very challenging. And that's why the umbrella legislation has to be brought forward. But it's about more than that for me. It's also about how we make sure that the burden on those who do the right thing is lower than the burden on those who do the wrong thing. So if we look at, for instance, the core regulation of our sector, the 2003 conduct regs, I mean, 2003 for lots of us doesn't feel that long ago. I mean, Scotland haven't qualified for the World Cup since then, certainly. But if you look at the way the labour market runs, we're in a fundamentally different age. Right down to the fact we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have tablets, we didn't have biometric identity, and so forth. So there is a case also for thinking about how we move things on, move regulation on. But compliance has to matter as much as enforcement. And for us, the really interesting point for REC in Matthew's speech is this discussion of more robust forms of voluntarism. Now we start a long way down the road on this. We test our members. I chucked 44 out last year. For not passing our compliance test. We have the ability to audit them. We have a complaints process for both clients and agency workers to come to us for resolution, and if we can't resolve it, to pass it on to the PSC, where one of our Professional Standards Committee, where one of Kate's colleagues at TUC and a representative from the CBI are present, as well as some independent people from our membership. I think that is a pretty robust system. Do I think it could be more robust? Yes. And we constantly think about how we do that. There are a couple of frustrations for me in how we're running it at the moment. One is there are certain public frameworks that you have to be accredited to supply through, but we're not the only way of doing that. You can be accredited by someone else. We have a case within the last few months of someone that we have thrown out of membership, joining another one, getting accredited and getting back onto the framework. So that point that Matthew raised about the standards of those of that more robust voluntarism, I think, is really important. And the balance has to be key, because any voluntary system has to be owned by the sector, not owned by government. So in that interaction with the SEB, when it is formed, and what its role is, I think is vitally important. The other thing about the SEB is, and no disrespect to the civil servants in the room, Whitehall is really good at navel gazing, and one of the worries that my members have is if it, as AES roll into the SEB, is there any loss of focus on actually getting the job done? Is there any loss of resources in getting the job done? I think that's really, really important. But also important is that it has a home in government. I mean, Matthew famously has two bosses. They have different views of what is important, and we need to achieve a really robust debate about our labour market, linked to what you said earlier, Torsten, about what the strategy is and how we are taking it forward over time to allow for things like immigration, where our point into government is, if you are going to have any form of low wage entry into the country to fill labour shortages, give the visa to the individual, not to the company.
because if you give it to the company, you're just creating an opportunity for exploitation. So the whole slew of things there, and I mentioned IR35 there, the best discussion that we're having at the moment on the legal helpline is where one of our members has said to someone, to a company that's bringing contractors onto PAYE, okay, what are you going to do about the agency workers regs then? And their client says, no one else has talked to me about that. And that's the real challenge. It's universal acceptance of what the standards are. If we go back to the original Low Pay Commission, the decision they made, and neither Kate nor I can take credit for that, we weren't around at the time, was that it is businesses and workers who are the ultimate deliverers of compliance because they know what should be happening and have the ability to call it out. I think as we go into the SEB, that's really, really important. On employment status, I would note that the test actually is clear, but it appears only to be clear to High Court judges. And
they change their mind.
Well, occasionally. But on that basis, the real challenge is in that space that I've just discussed, which is about companies accepting the fact that what you write in the contract is not the employment status, and us all being much more robust about it. I like that. I also, just as I said, like the hand car washes point, because I'd observe it is one of the few sectors which has fewer robots in it today than it had 15 years ago, and that has to be a sign of something.
The robots are not taking those jobs. Right, thank you very much. So let's just pick up an element of the question. So there's a lot of optimism in lots of what you've all said, and definitely in the speech, Matthew, which is basically the mood of talking about enforcement and good work is up. Matthew, you said the public really wants this stuff taken seriously. But let's just challenge that, as because the dangers we all agree on that, and then maybe we're not. So the challenge to that is, so let's take the example of hand car washes. So who in this room has used a hand car wash for their car at any time in the last year? Anyone? It's because you're bloody London, you don't drive, do you? Look at a report we did yesterday on the blue wall seats. 85% of people commuting to work via car. That is not what happens in Westminster. All right, everyone washes their car with hand car washes, even if you lot are weird, okay? But people, you can't drive through a hand car wash and not know what is going on. You can't get your car washed for £10 at the minimum wage with employment standards. That's not possible, but everyone is doing that up and down this country, otherwise they wouldn't be there, okay? So is the public really supporting what we think, or are they perfectly happy so long as it's not their kids working in the hand car wash for that to go ahead? So one, the public, are we sure their level of engagement is what we want it to be? Secondly, the government. So Matthew provided a reasonably crystal clear version of this, which is your predecessor had a report out on what should be happening on enforcement during 1920, and we are basically a year on, and there's been no response to that before the next one comes out. Yes, the Tory Conservative Manifesto does include what we think is a welcome commitment to the single enforcement body, but exactly what will be in the employment bill, the progress we are making on the employment status issue raise, these issues they're not proceeding at lightning speed, partly because they are hard. So on both the public and the government, let's do our optimism, pessimism test of how real is progress. Matthew?
Well, I think the point is, I have a background in public policy, and so it's a relative issue. So sometimes, the really intractable public policy questions is where there is a very strong group of the public who are deeply hostile to reform. So if you take something like school selection, what we could do to try to ensure that schools have a more mixed intake, there is just a really powerful group of middle-class parents who will fight tooth and nail to stop that. I don't think there is a really powerful group of the public who are hostile to improving the quality of compliance. And it's a big ask to say to people, don't use a hand car wash if a hand car wash is there. Will there be a public pushback against the idea that hand car washes should be licensed? No. So I think, relatively speaking, the public are supportive of this. They are probably not themselves going to make huge personal sacrifices, but they will be perfectly happy for the government to have a structure.
So it's kind of negative optimism, basically.
Yeah, and then I think in relation to the government as well, I think I'd say a kind of similar thing, really, which is that, I don't think that there is a kind of hostility in government to trying to get regulations to work. I don't think that there is a kind of deregulatory ideology which is hampering the possibility of pragmatism. I think the government is overloaded. I think there's lots of complexity. I think sometimes government lacks a bit of imagination, which is one of the reasons I'm very keen that the SEB conversation is not one that is primarily internal, but really does have a kind of public conversation about how we can have a body at arm's length from government that really is a champion for workers and feels like it's a champion for workers and for good employers. So, it's not optimism, pessimism. Is this something where we can? Are there insuperable barriers to us making progress? No, they're not.
I think that counts as optimism, sneakily in. Right, Kate, let's be a bit tough on you. Okay, so on this, here's an example of like potential barriers to change. Okay, so, and you brought up the employment status issue. So here's a challenge for the trade unions or people that are representing workers who are currently benefiting from being, for tax reasons, classified as self-employed, but who even their representatives would like to be classified as workers for the state of employment status. They want them to have minimum wage protection and other protections, but they don't want to say to them, you're going to have to pay your national insurance.
Like the GMB deal. The GMB deal at Hermes was a good example.
So I've got like a long list of like this going on. So the danger is the government will propose proposals which attempt to clarify the situation. It will mean some people pay more tax, in brackets they should be paying the tax anyway. The union representatives who want the attractiveness of the employment rights, half of that, will say, well, we should be allowed to have that and the low tax situation. And the danger is that provides, although no one intentionally wants to stop things happening, a like barrier to progress. What do you reckon?
I mean, that's a kind of, the TUC represents a huge range of different unions, from camera technicians to tour operators, many people who are working in sometimes indeterminate status. And we've had to talk to people about, what kind of trade-offs to form a collective position. But our collective position is if you had a single worker status which delivered people a significant uplift in their rights, and that's the key to it. You can't just say, sure, we're going to have alignment and a lot of you are going to pay more tax, but there's nothing coming along with that. There's no benefit for the wider movement. There's no kind of ending of this kind of two-tier division between insecure, low-paid workers who get fewer rights and more secure employees, like probably most people in this room, who benefit from the full range of employment rights. So sure, there is a trade-off.
So I understand that we don't want a worker status, we want everyone in full employment.
Yeah, and that's always been our
But can I ask, because I'm genuinely interested, if you did have full employment status for everybody other than those who are self-employed, would you also recognise that those with full employment status should be paying employees' national insurance and their employer should be paying employers' national insurance?
I mean, our position for a long time has been that the alignment, first you want to fix the employment law problem and that the tax problem might be different, basically. So we haven't called for the alignment of tax and status. But if you were thinking about the trade-offs, the first thing is you get the people who are lacking rights. There are, of course, other things you could do to clarify this position significantly. So, as Neil said, High Court judges have consistently found that people in these dodgy situations are workers for the purpose of employment status. One of the things that hampers that going further is that employment tribunals currently cannot make wider recommendations, so that finding then applies to people in a company. So individuals have to take cases again and again and again. The other thing we could say is let's flip the responsibility onto the employer. So rather than in an individual having to take it, if the default employment status was at least worker, I mean, we would argue for employee, and the employer had to prove that these people were self-employed rather than vice versa, then at least you'd be shifting the kind of responsibility. Okay. So we don't, we can change this debate without kind of opening up that massive kind of complex issue. But if we are going to open up the complex issue, it has to be about, the first aim has to be about delivering people more rights.
But they should pay their tax too, shouldn't they? Just putting it out there. They should pay their tax. Right.
Well, it's not so much them paying their tax; it's their employers paying their tax.
Oh, right, but let's not pretend the incidence of the tax doesn't. I mean, let's not kid
it's
like.
13.8%.
I know
different.
it comes on the way. In the end, there's a reason why self-employed people don't want to. That's true, but the incidence of the tax in the end is going to fall as much on it's the people who are like accountants and lawyers are making lots of cash, not paying their proper tax. Pay your tax, people. Right now, so. You guys are, you're like, oh, this is all very positive, we're good guys, we're pro this enforcement stuff, but you represent the people that you haven't kicked out within the agency sector. If we just jack up voluntarism and say we're going to have tough sectoral rules, we've all agreed them, but the people that are not signed up to your rules carry on being outside the system, the people that are doing the dodgy stuff are like, oh, this is all really interesting. All you've done is increase the ability for me to carry on being dodgy. So, in the end, are we like, you're the respectable face of this, but how are we going to get to the dodgy geezers?
So I think one of the things is that, I think the REC badge has to mean something for the REC to mean anything. And therefore, I'd rather kick people out and have a smaller organisation and make sure that buyers buy REC members with confidence. I think my biggest challenge is a cultural challenge, which is 77% of British chief executives say talent is their biggest challenge. And then that's handed over to what is frankly a sector in crisis in HR, who aren't answering that. I would argue, in my geeky way, it's because they're all following kind of American HR orthodoxy and not engaging with employee relations as they should. But actually recruitment and resourcing, which is, if anything, the fundamental first purpose of HR, doesn't go to them anyway. It goes via the finance director to procurement. So what you hear from businesses, and kind of be the business about productivity and better management and engagement and all of that, in many cases isn't actually percolating to what my members are being asked, because as yet the buyer side hasn't responded as much as I would like it. So if we could supercharge the fact that you have to buy on a standard, it doesn't need to be mine, but you have to buy on a standard and buy on value and values.
So you want the kind of the guild kind of protection of standards to be strengthened, and you're saying we should do that via the people purchasing the labour?
Well, I think we have to help the people, the purchase side. That's why we set up the Good Recruitment Collective, which has 500 companies that employ 3.5 million people in it, who we're helping with how you do this well. And that's not subsidy from my agency members to employers. It's about starting to build a culture, and it will take years to get that to the right place. But the most important thing is getting the buyer side thinking about what do you want, because even in blue collar logistics, so where you're supplying temps into food manufacturing, the businesses that are investing in temp experience are saving their clients money, because guess what? It's cheaper to have one temp that stays for 6 weeks than 3 that stay for 2 weeks.
Okay.
And we need to make that point.
Okay. Torsten, can I just say something more about this issue of robust voluntarism? Mm-hmm. I've spoken to investors, I've spoken to companies at the top of supply chains that really care about their reputation. I've spoken to public procurers, and as Kate says, there are really good examples. Wales is doing some fantastic work in relation to this, for example, the Welsh Assembly. So I think that there are people who would like to have some way of being able to make choices which gave them some reassurance that they were less likely to be complicit in labour exploitation. I have to say to Neil, with all due respect to Rec, that I think that very, very few, if any, trade associations would come anywhere near reaching the kind of threshold that I would want for a scheme to be given a kind of seal of approval by the bodies or by the SEB, even in the circumstances of saying that any seal of approval doesn't absolutely guarantee you anything, just like GLAA licensing in agriculture doesn't guarantee you there isn't funny business going on. So I think we'd have to go a lot further. And it may be ultimately, it's not realistic for trade associations because of their incentives, which are to have as many members as possible. I run an organisation that has members, so I know about those incentives. It's not realistic. I think what I'm saying really is there's a gap in the market. And the gap in the market is for organisations that really can put in place very thorough auditing methods, which would have all sorts of characteristics, like, for example, advertising a whistleblower's number so that anyone could phone up and say, look, my company's got this seal of assurance, but it's not living up to it. Opening their data to the bodies so they can properly inspect it. Issues like demonstrating that people have been thrown out, spot checks, all of that. I think if you did put that together, there's a lot of people, investors, top of supply chain, public procurers, who would use such a scheme. And I just think at the moment, the bodies are standing away from wanting to be in the business of auditing voluntary schemes because they just don't think they'll ever be credible.
Yep.
And the people who could put these schemes together are standing back from doing them properly because the incentives aren't quite right for them. And I think there's something we could explore there.
Okay. So can I just have a quick
reply
on that?
I was going to quickly hear from Lindsay on optimism, pessimism of where the debate is on enforcement at the moment.
I think it's clear there's a lot of energy around the debate. One of the observations I wanted to make from our research work, and this is from a qualitative project, is that I think we increasingly we treat the enforcement issue as if there's kind of bad guys and good guys. And one of the things that came out of the work that we did a couple of years ago was that actually poor practice is often peppered sort of widely through business practice. And I think that's a huge challenge for enforcement agencies to grapple with. It's much easier to think there's a particular sector or a particular group of workers that you can just target and kind of be done with. And how the agency world and the single enforcement body deals with that, I think, is really critical.
Okay. Right, let's get a first round of questions, and Neil's going to also reply to that suggestion while we're doing that. So, there's two there next to each other, Rob, at the back, in the middle, and the gentleman far back right.
Hi, just picking up on...
Give us your name, madam.
Sorry, Belinda Johnson. I'm a researcher for the Freelancer and Contractor Service Association, the FCSA. Just picking up on Matthew's comment about aiming at a moving target. Just wanted to ask the whole panel, really, a question about the umbrella companies. So the FCSA mapped the marketplace in 2017, and we found about 260 trading companies. We've recently remapped it and found in excess of 400. Do the panel have any views that they could share in relation to how they feel that government should very swiftly aim to stem that moving target?
Okay, great question. And there was a lady right in front of you as well. You're back on, Francis. Hold it in front of you. Speak to power. Right, we'll take the question over here while we wait. Go ahead, sir. Turns out we can't turn your mic on anyway. Can we turn a mic on?
I can hear you all right.
Speak away, Robert.
Yeah.
Okay. I can speak quite loudly.
Excellent, excellent.
I hear this debate about optimism and pessimism. I've written a certain amount about this from the sharp end, and it just seems a little bit unrealistic because you hear one of the first things you hear when you start talking about this is that the UK has half the number of labour inspectors the International Labour Organisation recommends. And then when you start okay, here we are. And then when you start looking at it practically, you see that there are whole sectors like cleaning where you never see a labour inspector. And then when you get down to the real nitty-gritty, I wrote recently about a story about a bunch of women, about 30 women, were taken to a couple of universities, kept in conditions that were effectively modern slavery. A group that was working with them phoned the GLAA before they even went there, told them what was going to happen, and nothing was done about it until the penultimate day of the 3-month contract when the GLAA turned up when everybody had run away and said there wasn't any labour abuse going on. So I just wonder how, in that context, when the and I don't think it's necessarily the GLAA's fault. I think they've got 90 inspectors for 10 million workers in vulnerable sectors.
Okay, that's a great question.
How can we say that there's any kind of serious attempt to regulate this going on?
Great. Right, Francis, let's try again.
Oh, that's better.
Right.
Frances Coppola, writer. I actually wanted to pick up a bit about this little minor disagreement that was going on between Kate and Torsten.
We're not disagreeing.
No. About taxation versus employment rights. Because we seem to be straying a little bit down the path towards taxation somehow buys employment rights, and no, it doesn't. National insurance buys certain benefits, which the most important is the state pension. We might need to have a discussion about the fact that at the moment, self-employed people now get the same state pension as employees, even though they pay far less national insurance. But I think we need to separate out discussion about employment protections, because does that really have anything to do with taxation? I don't think it does.
Okay, great. Right. Right of response, and then what are we going to do about these umbrella companies?
So, right of response. I mean, I buy Matthew's scepticism of what trade associations might do. My response would be my membership goes up when I chuck people out because members love it. You listed some things that trade associations don't do, but you listed several things that we do. There are posters up in our members with a contact number and so forth. I don't pretend that it is not a challenge for business associations to do this. But the question is, if we don't do it, who will? Because with the greatest respect, a government-led system will not work because it will not be embedded in the complexity of the sector. So you need in some way and in some form to have business ownership in how you make this work effectively.
Okay, great reply.
Well, the second bit of it is just that I'll come to them. Yeah. The second bit of it is just that you, as you develop that business ownership, you need to get to the supplier side, because I absolutely hear what lots of people at the top of companies are saying. It's not how they buy services.
Great.
Full stop.
Good point.
On umbrellas, that's
Yep.
part of the driver.
How do we get it?
What's our advice to recruiters? Don't use an umbrella that's not an FCSA accredited member. I think that's the first place to start. I think then within that there does need to be a regulatory framework that mirrors the kind of expectations that we are under the conduct regs. Because there are reasons, as I said earlier, to use an umbrella, but they should not be about avoiding national insurance or VAT.
That is what they are. Now, okay, why don't you come back on Francis's question, and we should, obviously you can agree forcefully with Robert's Inspector call.
Three really quick points just before I get to Francis. Well, two before I get to Francis' point. I mean, umbrella companies, we can't see the purpose. We don't think they should exist. On Robert's point, I mean, obviously we agree with the need for a significant uplift in resources, and I think it's part of the way that the UK basically undervalues our low-paid workers is we don't invest in ensuring that their rights are met. But I do think that point about can we do more with the resources we've got, and it sounds like a really boring point, but third-party protocols. So when those when the people were phoning up the GLAA and saying we think there's an issue here, what information do they get back at that point? Actually can make a bit of a difference to, how often people report this and the effectiveness of this. On Francis' point, I mean, we basically agree, and that's why I was saying that, we do not think that kind of questions of employment status, which are determined in employment law, and questions of taxation, which are different, should be the same. I do think if you are taking it strictly on a taxation problem, even if Dawson does say, the instance of taxation falls on the worker, which I think is actually slightly more debatable than it's sometimes put out to be, if you were looking for where the tax gap is and who controls the behaviour and whose behaviour you're trying to shift, it would be on the employers. And I think we have to take that seriously.
That is great. Now, can we just take Robert's question and then as a bit of a challenge to kind of the general approach you're setting out, which is, so a different way of coming at like the British enforcement regime, UK enforcement regime, is to say the defining feature is that we expect agency to sit with the worker to bring a challenge via employment tribunals or ACAS or otherwise, or other firms to basically call out the worst in their sectors, which is the voluntarism approach, whereas other countries would just be going in, knocking down the door and saying it's our job as the state to enforce this. It's not about getting a regulatory system in for the car wash industry. Why aren't the bloody police and others on the doorstep saying you're all breaking the law and you're going to jail? Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly on the points. I mean, in terms of Francis's point, I mean, look, one of the things that I couldn't really press in my Good Work review, because in the end it just didn't feel like there's any chance of making much progress on, is I just think that labour should be taxed at the same rate regardless of who provides it. And I also think that we ought to be trying to make sure that self-employed people have much greater protections when it comes to things like sickness and pensions and stuff like that. And I think we're kind of moving in a crab-like way because of the problems of national insurance, the difficulties that Philip Hammond had when he tried to propose some incredibly sensible reforms. We're moving crab-like towards where we ultimately need to be, which is, the way in which we tax labour doesn't really make any sense, and there's no reason why it couldn't be a lot simpler with benefits for everybody. On umbrellas, the two things that I think practically we ought to be doing is a lot of work on umbrellas is happening in HMRC around the kind of tax issues to do with umbrellas. It's really important to join that up with the issues that people have in relation to employment rights. So there's a combined effort on that. Secondly, I just don't think, I'm not sure I agree that umbrellas should be abolished, because I think some of them are some individuals find umbrellas quite useful, freelancers and others. I don't think they should be allowed to dock wages. That's a dodge of getting away around the agency regulation. So I would simply say that umbrellas are not allowed to make deductions from wages. In relation to Robert's point, look, first of all, I should say I think the work you do, Robert, is fantastic, and so thank you for doing just really high quality journalism that exposes many of these issues. You're right about the number of inspectors. Do I think it's likely to change? No, not really, because we are in a tight position in relation to public spending, and I wonder whether, whatever we might want, whether the public would prioritise more labour market inspectors above more hospital consultants. So you have to be realistic, I think, about what's likely to happen in the current situation. We have to make the best use of the resources that we've got, and that's where I'm focused. But the other thing I'd say is this. I read your article and I read all your stuff, Robert. I think the thing is, and this is why I said what I said about hand car washes, the problem often is that when inspectors go in, even when they know there are issues, it's actually very difficult to be able to prove anything. And that's because quite often what you've got is a level of connivance or a level of people not wanting to dob in. So, we don't get many complaints from people who work in hand car washes. Yep. They're being paid £2.50 now, but it's better than what they get paid in Romania. So, and it is, I think most of the people who work in hand car washes are Romanian. We know that there are particular places and particular sectors where there seem to be terrible problems. You can put all the inspection teams, and this has happened, I'm not going to name where and when, and you can't find anybody who will actually go on the record and say there are problems. So all I want to say is that some of this is not to do with the negligence of the agencies or the lack of attention and desire to do something. It's actually quite difficult to prove things. Yeah. And the reason that I'm advocating licensing and hand car washing is that it does provide, the great thing about licensing, it means that you can do something, which is if there are breaches, you can simply take the license away and close the business down. And even in some of these areas, you can go in, you can find infringements, you can find problems, but it's not actually possible to close the business down, or if you do, it just gets phoenixed and opens down the road. So making the change, getting the difference you want isn't as easy as you might imagine.
That's definitely the experience in Leicester of trying to close down.
Well, you've mentioned it now, but yes, that is the issue in Leicester.
Yeah, in Leicester, no one wants to go to court. Right, okay, let's get 2 more questions and then release people for the day. Okay, we'll take 3 because you 2 are next to each other. That's kind of only 1. Come on, Rob, let's get the pace going. We've got to get out on time. The gentleman at the back as well. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much. Nick Clark from Middlesex University. I just wanted to ask a question about how penalties are imposed, because having looked at it quite a lot, the issue of limited liability, of getting companies to pay or not pay, I mean, they can be fined anything you want if they actually just go out of business and start up the next day. So the controlling minds are often not involved in any of the penalties, and that seems to me quite a serious problem. One of the reasons, I think Lindsay's absolutely right, there's no easy line between compliant and non-compliant behaviour. In fact, professionally speaking, the more clever you can be about creative compliance, I think it's been addressed.
Let's get the questions quickly. Because
actually, you will get rewarded from coming up with a system for getting around the law. Okay. But could you say something about maybe personal liability of the professionals involved and the individual owners of businesses?
Great. And the lady next to you.
Clara Skrivankova from Trust for London. We fund quite a lot of work in London around both employment rights but also immigration, and I would like to take the discussion back to the point around the changes that we are about to say. And Matthew's point about people not being willing to report, I think it is absolutely essential that there is a line of separation between enforcement in employment rights and immigration enforcement. And we can't have enforcement at the workplace being used as a backdoor to immigration enforcement. So I would like to see your views on how this can be done and looking at things like safe reporting. Mm-hmm. And just a quick one on voluntary systems. I think there is a great deal of discussion internationally that is actually now led by major corporations like Mondelez International, who saying voluntary standards do not work. What we need is some form of mandatory due diligence along supply chains written into law, because otherwise those who don't want to comply will not.
Great. 2 questions there, and gentleman there.
Daniel Ferguson from the House of Commons Library. There's been some discussion of employment status from various members of the panel, and I've been following with some interest the Californian legislation, AB5, on employment status. And what happened as a result of that was that Uber, Lyft, etc. just changed their terms and conditions slightly to evade it requiring court cases. If we are to introduce employment status tests in legislation, what measures need to accompany that?
Okay, that is a great question. Fine. Let's do you want to pick up, Lindsay, do you want to pick up the next question on penalties, given that some of the recent work we've done?
Yeah, I mean, we published a paper about a month ago looking at penalties that are imposed for national minimum wage non-compliance, and in essence, what it finds is that there's obviously civil penalties and then there's criminal penalties, and largely speaking, firms are not subject to those penalties, and especially not criminal. I mean, the numbers on the criminal prosecutions of firms and individuals are absolutely minuscule, and I mean, I think it does go back to the point I raised at the beginning about the burden we're putting on HMRC in that case to adjudicate on intentionality, because clearly there seems to be a sort of a presumption that firms have made a legitimate mistake and that they're kind of wafted through. That's not to say that there isn't a kind of there needs to be a careful line walked between a system that is fair on firms and as opposed to overly punitive. But I think the research we've done recently suggests that we should interrogate that a bit closer.
Okay. Matthew, migration, how are you going to navigate?
Yeah, I mean, I agree on the third point. I think when we look at employment status, we have to do something which doesn't just simply move the boundaries and then get people to game those boundaries. We have to think about, for example, changing the kind of default, for example, as Kate said. Yes, look, one of the things I take out of this conversation, which is something we had thought about, but I take out of the conversation, we need to think about it a bit more in the office, is this relationship between immigration and enforcement. Is something David Metcalfe mentioned, my predecessor, something I've mentioned. And if you look at something like, for example, what's going on with the national referral mechanism, for example, that's possibly one of the kind of points now where you can see how those two systems are really crashing into each other, and in ways which are going to have to be addressed, because the system is under incredible strain. So, no, I think that is a good point, and I'm genuinely interested in. You said, Torsten, that in America these systems are looked at much more together. So I'd like to hear more about that, because I think it's an important point.
Kate?
Totally agree on the immigration point. Just on penalties, worth noting that David Metcalfe did suggest a significant increase in the size of civil penalties, and I think that's part of the recommendations that government have not yet responded to, so we might like to get a response. I guess I'm just going to kind of repeat my points on status, that any change would need to be managed carefully, but those things like being able to make wider recommendations from employment tribunals, so that if you took one case and said, well, no, actually the substance that you may have changed the words in the contract, but the substance of it shows that you're clearly trying to game the system, that would then have wider implications for the rest of their workforce, are the kind of changes that you'd need to accompany any reform.
So I'll just come back on the point about the mention of Mondelez and the international standards. I absolutely recognise that. I mean, if you look at British retail, they love licensing in the run by the GLAA because it gives them a measure of confidence in what's happening in the sector. And licensing is a tool in the box for sectors where you need it, like hand car washing. The point I would come back to is you don't do one or the other. You do both of them, and they serve different purposes. So, as I broke Torsten's rule earlier, you do need legislation. We do need legislation on umbrellas, but equally you need something on top of that, because it's not just about satisficing, it's about doing things well. And I think that can't be driven by the law alone.
Great. Look, I apologise for overrunning. Everyone, can we thank our panel for all their thoughts this morning? There's been lots of... You've given us all lots of food for thought. You've obviously all been very bad in proposing actual regulatory changes, but if nothing else, it has reminded us all that it's easier to make rules than to enforce them, even during think tank chats. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.